The IT guy told me I was using the software wrong. Wait until he finds out I coded it. He leaned over my shoulder so close I could smell his energy drink breath and said I was doing everything wrong. His name was Derek Hoffman, and he had this condescending way of clicking his tongue whenever he saw my screen. That's not how you use the interface at all. Did you even read the manual? He reached past me to grab my mouse without asking, his hand actually shoving mine aside as he took control. I pulled my hand back and watched him navigate through the software I'd spent 3 years building from scratch. The software that had been acquired by Nexus Tech for $87 million 6 months ago. The software where every single line of code came from my brain, my late nights, my failed relationships because I chose debugging over dinner dates. But Derek didn't know that. Nobody at this company knew that the new junior developer they'd hired was actually David Kaplan, though I went by my middle name here, just Kai. The acquisition contract had a non-compete clause that kept me out of the industry for a year, but it said nothing about getting a regular job at the company that bought my creation. So here I was, sitting in a gray cubicle, watching Derek explain my own software to me, like I was a child who'd never seen a computer before. Derek's fingers flew across my keyboard, typing commands that were technically correct, but inefficient as hell. See, you're trying to access the backend through the main dashboard, but that's not what it's designed for. The architecture doesn't support that kind of query. He was so confident, so absolutely certain that I was the idiot in this scenario. What he didn't know was that I'd specifically designed the architecture to support exactly that kind of query, because I'd anticipated users would need that flexibility. The main dashboard access was actually the fastest route to the backend, but Derek had apparently never read the actual documentation, just the simplified user guide that the marketing team had written. I bit my tongue and nodded along while he continued his lecture, explaining how real developers approached these problems. The urge to correct him was physical, like an itch I couldn't scratch, but I'd learned over the past 2 months that staying quiet revealed far more than speaking up ever could. Derek had been the senior IT administrator at Nexus for 5 years, and according to office gossip, he'd positioned himself as the resident expert on my software the moment the acquisition went through. He'd apparently spent one weekend reading through some of the public documentation and decided that made him qualified to train everyone else. My team lead, Patricia Lim, walked by and paused at my cubicle. "Derek, are you helping Kai with the integration issues?" She had this hopeful tone, like maybe Derek's involvement would actually solve something instead of making it worse. Derek straightened up, puffing his chest out slightly. "Yeah, I'm showing him the proper way to navigate the system. A lot of people make these same mistakes when they're new to enterprise software." He said, enterprise software, like he was saying, rocket science, with this weight that suggested mere mortals couldn't possibly understand. Patricia nodded and moved on, and I caught her shooting me a look that suggested she'd been on the receiving end of Derek's expertise before. After she left, Derek continued his tutorial, now pulling up his own screen to show me examples. "See, I've actually been working on optimizing the core functions. The original developer clearly didn't understand scalability." He pulled up a code file, and I felt my eye twitch. Those were my functions. The ones I'd spent 6 months optimizing, the ones that had been specifically praised in the tech press for their elegant scalability solutions. Derek had added about 200 lines of completely unnecessary code that actually slowed everything down by creating redundant processes. I couldn't help myself. "What does this section do?" I pointed at his additions, keeping my voice curious and innocent. Derek launched into an explanation that was technically gibberish, throwing around terms that sounded impressive but meant nothing in this context. He was like a student who'd memorized big words without understanding what they meant, stringing them together in ways that sounded plausible to non-programmers, but made no actual sense. "So you're basically creating a buffer cache for the redundant overflow?" I asked, using terms that also meant nothing but sounded equally impressive. Derek nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. I'm glad someone here is actually trying to learn instead of just clicking around randomly." He saved his changes and closed the file, completely missing how his optimization had just introduced 3 separate memory leaks that would crash the system under any significant load. I made a mental note to document this. The legal team had advised me to keep detailed records of everything happening with my software at Nexus, though they'd been vague about why. Something about potential future litigation and breach of contract claims, but they'd told me to just observe and document for now. That afternoon, I sat in the break room eating lunch while Derek held court with some of the other IT staff. "The problem with the original coder," he was saying, loud enough for half the room to hear, "is that they clearly prioritized flashy features over solid architecture. I've been having to basically rebuild the foundation while keeping everything running." The other IT guys nodded along, and I recognized the dynamic immediately. Derek was the alpha of this particular pack, and agreeing with him was easier than challenging him. One of the younger guys, Nathan Patel, looked uncertain. "But didn't the software win some awards for its architecture? I read that it revolutionized back-end processing or something." Derek waved this away dismissively. "Marketing hype. Awards don't mean the code is actually good, just that the company had a good PR team. I've seen the actual code, and trust me, it's amateur hour. Lot of shortcuts and band-aid solutions. Whoever wrote this probably learned to code from YouTube tutorials. The room laughed, and I took another bite of my sandwich, chewing slowly while watching Derek bask in the attention. He had no idea that the amateur he was mocking had a PhD in computer science from MIT and had been coding since he was 12. The problem started appearing 3 days later. The system began experiencing intermittent crashes, always during peak usage hours. Users were getting logged out randomly, data queries were timing out, and the customer support team was drowning in complaints. I watched from my cubicle as Derek rushed around trying to diagnose the issue, his confidence from earlier in the week notably absent. Patricia called an emergency meeting, and everyone from IT crowded into the conference room. Derek pulled up his diagnostic reports on the projector, walking everyone through his analysis. It's clearly a problem with the original code architecture. The system can't handle our user load. We're going to need to bring in an external consultant to do a complete overhaul. He clicked through slides showing error logs and crash reports, and I could see exactly what was wrong. Every single error traced back to the optimizations Derek had implemented. His redundant processes were eating up memory until the system choked, and his buffer cache was creating data conflicts that corrupted active sessions. But he'd designed his diagnostic report to make it look like fundamental flaws in the base code, carefully omitting any mention of his recent changes. Patricia looked stressed, rubbing her temples. An overhaul could take months and cost millions. Is there any short-term solution? Derek shook his head gravely. Not without risking data integrity. The best we can do is roll back to the pre-acquisition version, but then we lose all the features we've been building on. This was fascinating to watch, like seeing a train wreck in slow motion. Derek had created the problem, couldn't see that he'd created the problem, and was now proposing solutions that would make the problem worse. I raised my hand slightly, and Patricia nodded at me. I might have an idea. Every head in the room turned toward me, and I could see Derek's expression shift from stressed to annoyed. The error logs show memory overflow starting around Thursday at 3 p.m. What changes were implemented around that time? It was a simple question, but I already knew the answer. Derek's face colored slightly. I implemented some performance enhancements, but those were thoroughly tested. I nodded slowly, pulling out my laptop. Would you mind if I looked at the change logs, just to rule out any conflicts with the base code? Derek looked like he wanted to refuse, but with Patricia watching, he couldn't without looking defensive. Fine, but you're not going to find anything. Those enhancements are industry-standard practices. I pulled up the repository and started walking through Derek's changes line by line. Within 5 minutes, I'd identified 4 critical errors that any decent code review should have caught. Within 10 minutes, I'd mapped out exactly how those errors cascaded into the crashes everyone was experiencing. I explained it as simply as I could, using terms that non-programmers could follow, showing how Derek's buffer cache was actually creating duplicate data entries that conflicted with the original processing queue. Patricia leaned forward, suddenly very focused. Can you fix it? I nodded. I can write a patch in about 2 hours, roll back Derek's changes, implement a proper caching system that doesn't conflict with the existing architecture, and add some error handling to prevent this from happening again. The room was quiet, and Derek's face had gone from annoyed to pale. He tried to salvage the situation. That's a pretty bold claim from someone who's been here 2 months. No offense, Kai, but this system is complex. I met his eyes. The system is actually pretty elegant once you understand the underlying logic. The original developer built in a lot of flexibility, but you have to work with the architecture, not against it. I turned back to Patricia. I can have it done by end of day if you want. Patricia made a decision. Do it. Derek, work with Kai on this. I want both of you checking each other's code before anything goes live. Derek looked like he'd been asked to eat glass, but he nodded. Back at my cubicle, Derek pulled up a chair and watched my screen as I started coding. I didn't need 2 hours. I needed about 40 minutes, but I'd learned that underestimating time made people trust you more than overestimating. I wrote the patch, fixing Derek's mistakes while making it look like I was just adapting his approach. I added comments explaining what each section did, writing them at a level that Derek could understand, but that would also make it obvious to any actual programmer that I knew exactly what I was doing. Derek watched in silence, and I could feel his confusion growing. Every few minutes he'd ask a question, and I'd answer it simply, watching him realize that I understood the system better than he did. The patch worked perfectly. I deployed it at 4:30 p.m., and within minutes, the error rates dropped to 0. System performance actually improved beyond baseline because I'd taken the opportunity to optimize a few other bottlenecks I'd noticed. Patricia stopped by my cubicle at 5 with a smile. I don't know where you learned to code like that, but nice work, Kai. Derek had already left for the day without saying anything. That night, I got a message from my lawyer, Gregory Whitfield. The subject line just said, "Interesting development," and the body contained a link to an internal Nexus memo. Apparently, Derek had been sending emails to upper management claiming credit for major improvements to his software, specifically mentioning features and optimizations that I had built into the original code years ago. The memo was Derek's pitch for a promotion to Chief Technology Officer, based entirely on his supposed expertise with the system. Gregory's message continued, "This could be useful for the secondary claim. He's essentially committing fraud by claiming credit for your work. Document everything." I sat back in my chair, looking at my apartment that was significantly smaller than the house I'd been able to afford before selling my company. The acquisition had made me wealthy on paper, but the non-compete clause meant I couldn't work on anything similar, couldn't start a new company, couldn't even consult in my own field. Taking this junior developer job had been partly about staying sane, having something to do with my days, but also about seeing what Nexus was actually doing with my creation. The next morning, I arrived to find Derek already at my cubicle, looking uncomfortable. "We need to talk about yesterday." He shifted his weight from foot to foot. "I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot. You clearly know your stuff." This was as close to an apology as Derek was capable of, and I could see the calculation behind it. He'd realized I was a threat to his self-proclaimed expertise. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "I'm just trying to help the team succeed." Derek relaxed slightly. "Right, exactly. So, I was thinking, maybe you could help me with some of the more technical documentation. You seem to have a good grasp of the underlying architecture." Translation: he wanted me to do his work for him while he continued to take credit. I agreed, because watching Derek operate was providing invaluable documentation for whatever legal strategy Gregory was building. Over the next 2 weeks, Derek sent me increasingly complex problems, things he should have been able to solve himself if he actually understood the system. I solved each one, always explaining my solutions in ways that made it clear I understood not just the fix, but the fundamental design philosophy behind the code. Other people started noticing. Nathan, the younger IT guy, started coming to me with questions instead of Derek. Patricia assigned me to more critical projects. The customer support team started specifically requesting my help when issues came up. Derek's response was to double down on his expertise claims. He started a blog about optimizing legacy code, writing posts that were thinly veiled criticisms of my original architecture. He spoke at a local tech meetup about rescuing failed software projects, using examples that were clearly based on his work with my system. Each blog post, each presentation, each claim was screenshot and documented. Gregory sent me a message. "He's building our case for us. Keep going." But the situation at work was getting tense. Derek had started making comments about my attitude problem and how I didn't respect the chain of command. He complained to Patricia that I was undermining his authority by going around him to solve problems. Patricia called me into her office on a Friday afternoon. She looked tired. "Kai, you're doing great work, but Derek says you're not following proper protocols. He's your senior, and he needs to be kept in the loop on all technical decisions." I chose my words carefully. "I'm happy to follow protocols. Can you clarify what those are? Derek hasn't really outlined a clear process for escalation or approval." Patricia hesitated. "Just keep him informed, okay? Derek's been here a long time and he knows the company culture." That weekend, I did something I'd been avoiding. I actually read through the acquisition contract in detail, all 237 pages. Most of it was standard legal language, but buried in Section 12, subsection 4, I found something interesting. Nexus had the right to hire me as a consultant during the non-compete period to address technical issues with the software. And they had to pay my original consulting rate, which was $500 per hour. I'd never thought about it because I hadn't planned to work here, but now that I was already on staff as a regular employee making $75,000 a year, the implications were fascinating. On Monday, I scheduled a meeting with Patricia and HR. I need to clarify my employment status. I pulled out the relevant contract section. According to the acquisition agreement, if I work on the core software in any capacity, it needs to be under my consulting contract, not as a regular employee. The HR director, Linda Vasquez, read the section 3 times, her expression growing more concerned with each reading. She excused herself to call legal. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in a conference room with Patricia, Linda, the company's general counsel, and the CFO. The general counsel, Michael Brennan, had the contract spread out in front of him. "How long have you been working on the core software?" I pulled out my documentation. "Since my second day. Derek has been assigning me to fix critical issues with the system. I have logs of every project, every fix, every consultation." I slid the folder across the table. "That's approximately 320 hours of work over 2 months. Michael did the math in his head, and I watched his face go pale. 320 hours at $500 per hour was $160,000, plus the $12,500 I'd already been paid in salary. The CFO, James Thornton, was already typing on his calculator. "This can't be right. Why didn't Derek flag this?" Patricia looked confused. "Derek said Kai was just a junior developer. He's been assigning him to software maintenance." Michael flipped through my documentation. "This isn't maintenance. This is core architectural work, system optimization, emergency crisis management. This is exactly what the consulting clause covers." He looked at me. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I met his gaze calmly. I assumed HR had processed my employment correctly. I only reviewed the acquisition contract this weekend when I was trying to understand the proper reporting protocols Derek mentioned. The meeting ended with promises to sort this out and requests that I not discuss this with anyone while they investigated. That afternoon, Derek stopped by my cubicle looking smug. "Heard you had a meeting with the executives. Hope you didn't try to cause trouble. Companies don't like employees who rock the boat." I smiled politely. "Just clarifying some paperwork issues. Nothing major." But it was major, and over the next week, I watched the fallout spread through the company like a virus. HR launched an audit of all the work I'd been doing. They discovered that Derek had been systematically assigning me to high-level projects while documenting them as routine junior developer tasks. Every fix I'd implemented, every system improvement, every crisis I'd resolved was work that should have been billed under my consulting contract. The financial implications were bad enough, but then they found Derek's blog and his speaking engagements. The legal team was very interested in his public claims of rescuing and rebuilding software that he neither created nor apparently understood. Michael called me back in on Thursday. We need to discuss a settlement. He looked like he hadn't slept well. Your consulting contract entitles you to payment for all substantive work on the core software. Our audit shows approximately 600 hours of qualifying work. 600 hours at $500 per hour was $300,000. James, the CFO, was in the meeting again, looking like he was in pain. We'd like to negotiate a flat fee rather than hourly billing, and we need to discuss your ongoing role at the company. I waited, letting them make the first offer. Michael continued. We'll pay you $250,000 for all work completed to date, plus retain you as a consultant going forward at your contract rate for any future core software work. You'd move out of Derek's department entirely and report directly to Patricia. It was a good offer, but I wasn't done. I want Derek removed from any supervisory role over the core software. His modifications have introduced critical vulnerabilities, and his lack of understanding poses a security risk. I pulled out another folder. These are the 6 instances where his changes directly caused system failures. These are the optimization claims he's made publicly that are factually incorrect. And these are the emails where he claimed credit for features that were built into the original architecture. Michael and James exchanged glances. Michael spoke carefully. What exactly are you proposing? I laid it out simply. Derek moves to a different department with no access to my software. I get full architectural authority as primary consultant. Any public communications about the software's development go through me for technical accuracy. The settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. I got my $250,000 in back pay, a consulting contract that kicked in whenever I touched the core software, and a clause that gave me veto power over any public statements about the technical aspects of the system. Derek was reassigned to managing the company's internal IT infrastructure, away from anything touching my code. He cleaned out his desk on a Friday afternoon while I was in a meeting, leaving without saying goodbye to anyone. Patricia told me later that he'd been furious, claiming I'd sabotaged him, but the documentation of his errors and false claims made any formal complaint impossible. The blog came down within days, and his speaking engagement at the upcoming tech conference was quietly canceled. Nathan took over as the primary IT liaison for my software, and the difference was immediate. He actually read documentation, asked intelligent questions, and didn't try to fix things that weren't broken. But the real satisfaction came 3 months later when I got a call from Derek's new employer, a startup called Vector Sync, that wanted to license some technology. They'd called me because my name was on the patents. We hired Derek Hoffman as our CTO based on his expertise with your software, the startup's CEO, Amanda Foster, said. He's been advising us on building a competing system, and we wanted to make sure we weren't infringing on any of your IP. I asked a few careful questions and learned that Derek had grossly misrepresented his role in my software's development, claiming he'd been the lead architect who'd saved the project. The startup had offered him a significant equity stake based on these claims. I sent Amanda a detailed timeline of Derek's actual role, along with documentation of his technical errors and the settlement agreement that specifically outlined what work he'd actually done versus what he'd claimed credit for. Amanda called back 2 days later. We're terminating Derek's employment. Thank you for being honest with us. I never found out exactly what happened after that, but Derek's LinkedIn profile went quiet, and the few mutual connections we had mentioned, he'd left the tech industry entirely. Maybe he found somewhere else to be a big fish in a small pond, somewhere his technical limitations wouldn't be exposed so dramatically. Or maybe he finally learned that claiming expertise you don't have only works until you meet someone who actually knows what they're talking about. The experience changed how I thought about my work and my role in the tech industry. I started consulting for other companies who'd acquired software from small developers, helping them understand what they'd actually bought and how to work with it properly. I wrote articles about the importance of understanding your own systems rather than relying on self-proclaimed experts. I spoke at conferences about the gap between real technical knowledge and performance of technical knowledge, and how companies could protect themselves from the Dereks of the world. Patricia eventually offered me a permanent position as chief technology architect, but I declined. The consulting arrangement gave me freedom and flexibility that a staff role never could. Plus, the non-compete clause had expired, and I was starting to think about my next project. But I kept the Nexus contract, coming in a few days a month to maintain the software and train new developers. On one of those days, I was working in my old cubicle when a new junior developer stopped by. Excuse me, I'm having trouble with the back-end interface. The IT team said I should ask you. I looked at her screen and smiled. What specific issue are you having? She pointed at her code. I'm trying to access the database directly, but the documentation says I should go through the main dashboard. That seems inefficient. I pulled up a chair. Actually, the main dashboard route is faster. Let me show you why the architecture was designed that way. As I walked her through the logic, explaining the reasoning behind design decisions that most people took for granted, I realized this was exactly why I'd taken that junior developer job in the first place. Not for the money or the satisfaction of proving Derek wrong, though both were nice, but because I needed to understand how people actually used my creation, how they thought about it, where they struggled, where the documentation failed them. Derek had been so focused on being the expert that he'd never actually learned to use the tools at his disposal. He'd built his entire persona around knowing more than everyone else, and when confronted with actual expertise, he'd had nothing to fall back on. I spent an hour with the new developer, answering questions and explaining concepts, and she left with a genuine understanding of the system rather than just a rote solution to her immediate problem. That, more than anything else, felt like winning. Not the settlement money, not Derek's humiliation, but the ability to help someone learn something real. Later that evening, I got an email from Gregory with a subject line that just said, FYI. The body contained a link to a lawsuit filing. Derek was suing Nexus for wrongful termination, claiming he'd been scapegoated for problems with the software, and that his reassignment was retaliation for whistleblowing about technical issues. I called Gregory immediately. Is this going to be a problem? He laughed. For him? Yes. For you? No. We have documentation of every false claim, every technical error, every piece of credit he tried to steal. If this goes to trial, it'll destroy whatever's left of his professional reputation. The suit was quietly dismissed 6 months later after Derek apparently saw the evidence Nexus was prepared to present. But the experience left me thinking about how many other Dereks were out there, confidently explaining things they didn't understand, building careers on claimed expertise they didn't possess, and how many people suffered under that false authority. I started a blog of my own, anonymously at first, writing about technical myths, common misconceptions, and how to spot the difference between real knowledge and performed knowledge. It gained a following in the tech community, people sharing stories of their own encounters with false experts and the damage they'd caused. One reader reached out with a story about an IT manager who'd convinced his company to do a complete system overhaul that wasn't needed, costing millions and months of productivity, all because he needed to justify his position. Another wrote about a CTO who blocked every improvement suggestion because he couldn't understand the proposals and felt threatened by developers who knew more than him. The stories piled up, a catalog of technical incompetence masquerading as expertise, and I realized Derek wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a larger problem in tech culture where confidence was valued over competence, where the ability to sound smart mattered more than actually being smart, and where questioning the supposed experts was seen as insubordination rather than due diligence. I started doing workshops about technical leadership, how to evaluate claimed expertise, how to create environments where knowledge could flow freely without being bottlenecked by fragile egos. Companies brought me in to audit their technical teams and identify where communication was breaking down. More often than not, I'd find a Derek somewhere in the chain, someone who'd positioned themselves as indispensable by making systems seem more complicated than they were. 3 years after that first day when Derek grabbed my mouse and told me I was doing everything wrong, I sat in a keynote speaker chair at a major tech conference. The moderator asked me about the experience that had launched my consulting career, and I told a version of the story, names changed, details obscured, but the core truth intact. I learned that sometimes the best way to understand a system is to watch how people misunderstand it, I said. And I learned that real expertise isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing what you don't know and being willing to learn from anyone, regardless of their job title or time at the company. The audience laughed when I described Derek's face, realizing I'd fixed in 2 hours what he'd claimed would take months. They nodded knowingly when I talked about the patterns of false expertise I'd identified. And afterward, dozens of people came up to share their own Derek stories, their own experiences of being underestimated, of watching incompetent people fail upward while actual experts were ignored. That conference talk led to more speaking engagements, more consulting contracts, more opportunities to help companies identify and fix the Derek problem in their organizations. But the most satisfying moment came 4 years after the settlement, when I got an email from Nathan, the young IT guy who'd taken over when Derek left. Hey Kai, wanted to let you know I just got promoted to senior developer. I've been using the principles you taught me about really understanding systems before trying to modify them, and it's completely changed how I approach problems. Thank you for taking the time to actually teach instead of just showing off. You saved my career before I even realized it needed saving. That message meant more than any settlement check or successful lawsuit. Derek had treated people's ignorance as a resource to exploit for his own advancement. I'd tried to treat it as a gap to fill, a chance to help someone understand something real. And in the end, that difference in approach made all the difference. Derek was somewhere out of tech, his reputation destroyed by his own false claims. I was building a career helping companies avoid hiring their own Dereks, teaching real experts how to share knowledge effectively, and creating systems where competence mattered more than confidence. The software I'd built was still running, better than ever, maintained by people who actually understood it, rather than people who just claimed to. Sometimes I still think about that first day, Derek's hand grabbing my mouse, his absolute certainty that he knew better. I think about how close I came to just correcting him immediately, pulling rank, announcing who I really was, but staying quiet, watching, learning, documenting, that had taught me things that immediate confrontation never could have. I learned how people like Derek operated, the specific techniques they used to maintain false expertise, the warning signs that someone's confidence exceeded their competence. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. Sometimes it's just quietly being excellent at what you do until the truth becomes impossible to ignore, until the false expert's house of cards collapses under the weight of their own claims. Derek had told me I was using the software wrong. He'd been so sure, so confident, so completely wrong. And in his wrongness, in his arrogant insistence that he knew better, he'd given me everything I needed to not just prove him wrong but to build something better from the wreckage of his ego. That's the thing about false expertise. It's sustainable only in the absence of real knowledge. The moment someone who actually knows what they're talking about shows up, the whole performance falls apart. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.